Welcome to Underline This podcast where we unpack the big ideas hiding in the margins. Because the best parts, they're between the lines. I'm especially excited for the episode that we have today. We're going to be discussing The Art of War by Sun Tzu. We're going to be unpacking an overview of the book as well as who our author is. We'll go through key themes and takeaways, memorable moments and quotes, hot takes and controversies, ratings, and final thoughts. With that being said, again, I'm very grateful to all of our listeners that are listening to our podcast. Please give us a shout out and a review on YouTube and wherever you're listening to this podcast. And please give us a follow on social media. Let's dive headfirst into The Art of War. Now, who am I to be talking about The Art of War? Well, as a undergrad, I double majored in history and Asian studies. And it's not very often I get to actually use my Asian studies degree. And this is one of those moments. I spent 2 years in Taiwan. I've got the college education where we studied history, philosophy, and the economics of Asia, specifically China. And I did take several classes where we read transcripts from ancient Chinese philosophers. Also, not to brag, and I guess I can't brag too much anymore, but I was fluent in Mandarin. I could read and write. Not so much anymore, but I was. So there's my academic and experience to back up being able to talk about The Art of War. I do want to talk about why The Art of War is an important book and one that I would highly recommend everyone reread over and over and over again. The Art of War contains principles and ideas that you're going to find are highly applicable, whether it be in negotiations, business, philosophy, personal growth, politics, sports, competitions, management, navigating your career, or even personal relationships or dating. I can get a little creative with the dating one. I just want to think that one through a little bit more before I just speak off the cuff. But I want to give you some interesting facts around The Art of War. This is a book that is over 2,500 years old. It was written in the 5th century BCE by Sun Tzu. Now, something that's interesting to note about Sun Tzu is that there's really a big debate going on as to whether or not Sun Tzu was a real person or if this was a pen name for a collective group of generals. I tend to think that it's probably more a group of generals just because of how powerful and how concise these ideas are. Not to say that someone couldn't have this expertise, but I tend to think that there's not a lot of evidence that supports that this was an actual person. Then chances are this is probably a pen name that represents a group of ideas. The interesting thing about The Art of War as well is that it's very concise. It's only about 13 chapters. It's something that you could probably read in less than an hour. I don't recommend reading it in less than an hour because it's a lot like a cake where if you eat it piece by piece, you're going to enjoy it. If you do it all at once, it's probably not going to be that enjoyable of an experience. It's something that really you need to allow to marinate and you need to think it through, which is why I really enjoyed preparing for this podcast because I was able to go through the ideas and I was able to think about how this personally applies to me, to you, to different contexts. And again, that's just what really gave me a greater appreciation for the ideas that are in this book. Another interesting thing about The Art of War is that it's still being taught in military academies around the world. And the reason why that is because of the wisdom and the knowledge that it has about understanding strategy, when to use deception, how to address conflict, how to be a good leader. It's also one of the most commonly found books in CEOs, coaches, and just overall anyone that's a leader in their industry or in what they're doing. It's in their libraries. It's also been very influential in some disruptors in world history, such as Mao Zedong, Napoleon, and World War II generals such as Patton and MacArthur. It actually wasn't translated into English until around the 18th century when a Jesuit priest translated The Art of War into English. Now, let's talk about who Sun Tzu is. Now, I mentioned before that there's a big debate as to whether or not Sun Tzu is a real historical figure or if that's just a pen name. The reason why is that there's just not a lot of history that suggests that he was a real person. Also, the name Sun Tzu actually is just the name Sun. the proper name would probably be Sun Wu, but and this is where my Asian studies and Chinese kicks in. But that Zi actually refers to like a master. So when you think of Confucius or Buddha, um, they actually in their name. So, for example, Buddha in Chinese is Fouzu. Um, and then you also have Confucius, who's a Kongzi. So that like Zhu, that refers to a master. So really what we're seeing here with the name is that this is someone who is named Master Sun. So that's the family name. And I mentioned before that this is a 2,500-year-old book that was written a long time ago, but during the Eastern Zhou dynasty in BCE. Now, let's talk about what was going on. Let's paint the historical landscape of when this book was written. This happened, as I mentioned before, during the Eastern Zhou dynasty. This is a time when China was really made up of dozens of kingdoms. There was a central authority, but it was very, very weak, and the different kingdoms were ruled by feudal lords. Warfare was a constant thing going on. And military strategy, as a result, because of this constant warfare, became much more sophisticated. So, really, just putting that iron in the fire is what really helped refine these strategies and these ideas during a very tumultuous time. And this time during China, when the art of war came about, was during a period known as the 100 schools of thought that included great thinkers such as Confucius, Lao Tzu. And if you don't know who Lao Tzu is, he's the great thinker who helped start Taoism, and other philosophers as well that arose during this time. And again, going back with that time just being very tumultuous and having a lot of chaos and conflict, that's when there was an increase in thought as a result to chaos and what the thinkers at that time would label as moral decay. So it's very interesting to see that it was during this time that a lot of these ideas arose from the chaos. And another interesting too is that the art of war was a prerequisite prior to Qin Shi Huangdi that took control of China. If you don't know who Qin Shi Huangdi is, he's a famous Chinese emperor. He's actually known for being China's first emperor who united China. And he was known for his incredible military strategies. All right, let's talk about the different themes and some of my takeaways. If you were to take the art of war and you're going to boil it down into a single idea, that idea would be win without fighting. So the supreme art of war, and I'm quoting the art of war now, is to subdue the enemy without fighting. You're going to find that that's actually an idea that China today still practices. If you're someone who's a bit of a nerd and likes to watch geopolitical videos like myself, you'll notice that China is making a lot of moves and they're being aggressive in a lot of ways, such as expanding into the South China Sea almost inches by inches, or they're doing things and making big power moves enough to make advances while at the same time not causing a war. While there's conflict, it's not a war. And that's something that it's actually common, not just to China, but within the geopolitical sphere. So when you're thinking about the art of war, think of strategy is greater than brute force. So with this end in mind, we're going to pull from quotes that highlight the themes of the book and these ideas. Idea number one, win without fighting. We talked about that a little bit more, but let's unpack it. So to subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. So again, that is very common today in geopolitics. There's the use of proxies. There's the use of maybe using puppets to fight your battles for you. It's something that really it requires a lot of creativity to see what one can do to advance their position with the least amount of resources and the least amount of conflict. Idea number 2, know yourself and know your enemy. A quote from The Art of War is, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. This reminds me of another quote, which is, he who is prepared shall not fear. The way I see this is, going into any situation, if you know what you're up against and you know your own strengths and your own weaknesses, that gives you a clear vision as to what it is that you need to do to either practice or reinforce certain areas and also maybe protect certain areas, right? And so the way I think about this is, it's almost like preparing for a recital. Let's say that you're someone who plays an instrument, and as long as you're prepared and you know what you need to do in order to prepare, and you know what the event is going to entail, you can show up prepared and polished in order to make it a success. Now, I'm taking this principle out of the context of conflict and war, and just applying it into something simple as preparing for a recital, but I think you get the idea. Now, the next idea number 3, is that all warfare is based on deception. And a great quote here is, when able, appear unable, and when active, appear inactive. The idea of deception is all about misdirection. It's about obfuscating targets. And what I mean by obfuscating targets, sometimes when we overexpose ourselves, whether it be in a conversation or maybe in a negotiation, then we give the other side targets, and we give them insight, we give them details of where they can apply pressure. So it's all about, when it comes down to misdirection, it's about trying to limit the amount of targets for your opponent. So where you are weak, appear strong, and where you are strong, appear weak. And there's also another concept here, which I like to refer to as the pufferfish mentality when it comes to deception. Now, we're all aware of what a pufferfish is. I was fishing one time and accidentally caught a pufferfish. And it's very interesting because when you see them, they look like a tiny fish. And when they become threatened, all of a sudden they become the size of a dodgeball. And they can become pretty intimidating when all of a sudden it just puffs up. Now, I call this the pufferfish mentality because this is something that you will see quite a bit, whether it's a person that's selling themselves in an interview, in a date, or even a business. It's very interesting to see companies that will try and make themselves appear much stronger or much more impressive than they actually are. That's a pufferfish mentality. Sometimes that can be done for good, sometimes that can be done and it can be a negative. Now, there's also the reverse pufferfish mentality, and that's where if you are a giant, but you want to appear small, or maybe you want to hide in the shadows, right? To stay away from those that wish you ill, or maybe would want to interfere in what you're doing. An example of that to me is BlackRock. Now, if you're not familiar with BlackRock, they manage $10 trillion in assets, which means that they exceed the GDP of every country except the US and China. Recently, they've been getting more and more in the spotlight because of this, whether it be them purchasing property or just the fact that $10 trillion is an insane amount of wealth to be managing. Uh, they do a pretty good job of trying to stay out of the light so they can continue to expand and grow. And I would say that a lot of their success has been from misdirection. And when I say misdirection, that's that deception, meaning that they've tried to stay out of the light so they can continue to practice and grow and become bigger without becoming too big and getting too much attention. Although that isn't the case now because it's kind of hard to hide $10 trillion in assets that you own. Idea number 4, avoid prolonged war. There's a quote here which is, there is no instance of a nation benefiting from prolonged warfare. Pretty straightforward. In this case, just to help reinforce this idea, swift, efficiency, and decisive battles are greater than draining resources because one of the consequences of a prolonged war would be that one, you're draining resources, and second, you are also going to have a decline in morale. Now, this is a rule that I would give a disclaimer to, and I'll cite a real life scenario going on now, which is the war between Russia and Ukraine. I would argue that Ukraine has done a very good job of trying to be swift, efficient, and decisive. There was actually an attack recently, which will get an idea as to when this podcast was recorded. And that was when they were able to sneak drones into Russia, and they were able to strike billions and billions of dollars worth of aircraft equipment. And they were using drones that I think cost around $2,000 more or less to make. So that is an example of swift and efficient and decisive victories and using resources for greater outcomes. Now, with Russia, I would argue that in their perspective, having a prolonged war is what's going to be best for them. So it's very interesting to take this idea and see that we've got two sides of the same, well, we've got two different perspectives here, right? We've got Russia, who it's probably in their best interest to prolong the war, although arguably swift, efficient, decisive would be in their best interest. But in the case where they've got significantly more resources than Ukraine, a prolonged conflict is something that they have the stamina for. And the people may not have the stomach for it, but the nation and its leadership do. They're okay as long as they've got the stamina. Idea number 5. Strike where the enemy is weak. And the quote that I'll cite here from The Art of War is, attack him where he is unprepared, appear where you are not expected. When I read this idea, and as I was going off with that quote, this reminds me of David and Goliath. There's an excellent book by Malcolm Gladwell called David and Goliath, and he talks about the advantages of disadvantages. And one of the interesting things about David and Goliath is that when you look at it from the surface, it seems to make sense that this was a battle that Goliath should have won. But if you actually analyze it and you pick it apart, like Malcolm Gladwell has in his book, we realize that the slingshot at that time was almost like bringing a gun to a muscle fight. Uh, and so Goliath's strength, although he was large and he had armor, he was no match against a sling. It was quite literally like a gun. Another example I'll give is if you have seen Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, there's that scene where Indiana is trying to find his friend who's been kidnapped, and there's a crowd, and you hear someone yell, "There he is!" And then all of a sudden the crowd parts, and there's this really intimidating looking guy who's wearing a black turban, black robes, and he's got this giant saber, and he gives this villainous chuckle, and he tosses his sword back and forth, and he starts doing these impressive sword moves, and everyone's looking at him expecting to see him just slicing Indiana Jones into pieces. But what happens is Indiana Jones gives a sigh, reaches into his pocket, pulls his pistol, shoots the guy. The guy drops like a sack of potatoes, and he continues looking for his friend. The reason why I use that as an example is because you should be all when you're going up against a competition, you should always be looking out for weaknesses and then identifying your strengths and seeing where are their pressure points. What do I have that's going to give me a advantage? And in a lot of cases, you'll find that you are actually the one that has an advantage. And where their advantage is, you want to avoid that. You want to hit where they're weak. So in the case of Goliath and the swordsman from Indiana Jones, it's the fact that they brought swords to a slingshot and a gunfight. So when you're going up against a competitive opponent, go to their strengths, find out where their weaknesses are, and cut, cut, cut. On to the next idea, espionage. Quote from Art of War that highlights espionage is that it says, knowledge of the enemy's dispositions can only be obtained from other men. So in this case, knowledge is power. allows you to be more efficient, allows you to focus in and identify where your targets should be, and it increases the chances of success when making plans and going into war, whether that be a competition, a negotiation, or starting a business. Espionage really can be summed up as trying to gather as much information as possible so that you can make an informed decision. Next, number 7, adapt to situations. The quote here is, water shapes its course according to the nature of, let's see, can't read my own notes. According to the center of the ground. Might be misreading my notes here, but I've got another quote that I can actually pull out. That actually comes from Bruce Lee. If we all know who Bruce Lee is, I'm sorry for being redundant, but I'll say it anyway. Bruce Lee is an incredible fighter. He was very disciplined. He was also a iconic actor in kung fu movies. And one of my favorite quotes from Bruce Lee that I'm going to paraphrase here that relates to this, and apologies again for not being able to read my own notes, but Bruce Lee, when talking about reinventing oneself and adapting to situations, he cites a very similar, he paraphrases this quote as well, and I'm going to paraphrase him. So there's a lot of paraphrasing going around. But Bruce Lee says, be like water, my friend. When you see water enter into a bowl, it becomes like the bowl. When you see it enter into a cup, it becomes a cup. When it goes into a teapot, it becomes a teapot. Be like water, my friend. Be flexible. Again, that's a big paraphrase. But the idea of not being stuck in our ways and being able to adapt to be a flexible is incredibly important. There's a lot of really successful individuals that I think are walking examples of being able to adapt and reinvent themselves. I think it's really interesting to see artists, for example, like 50 Cent, be a walking example of this. For example, 50 Cent was someone who started out with rapping and then he expanded from rap to acting and then to writing screenplays and then acquiring properties. Uh, I actually saw it. Oh, I forgot where it was. I think it's in Maryland. I'll have to double check this, but it's not Maryland, it's somewhere else. But there's a city where he's actually the biggest property owner. So it's very interesting to see how he has been able to adapt and evolve and be like water and to flow and go into different directions and thrive. The next idea, strong leadership equals everything. A leader leads by example, not by force. Strong leaders inspire through charisma, courage, intellect. They have street credibility, meaning that they're not just someone that speaks with words, but they speak with their actions. They're someone that's trustworthy. They're someone that inspires those around them. Example that there are countless examples of strong leaders throughout history. I'm going to give a few, and one that just immediately comes to mind is Winston Churchill, someone that spent time in the military, someone that was fearless. I'm not saying he was perfect. I know I'm a historian. I know that there's no individual that is without their faults, but he is the leader that did prevent Germany from invading and obliterating England. He's the one that stopped that advance. Martin Luther King, another inspiring leader. He was a powerful orator. He knew how to communicate, inspire others to action, to do things that were terrifying. He also wasn't just advocating for people to show up and protest with nonviolence and get beaten and not fight back. He himself was in and out of prison. He himself attended these demonstrations. Another inspiring leader is George Washington. George Washington is an impressive leader to me because when you study him, you find out that the circumstances that he found himself in and were really not ideal. He had low resources. He was camping in, if you've heard of the Valley Forge, and you're a student of history, you'll find that during that time they were very ill equipped to be camping in the winter. It really is incredible that the United States won its war for independence, and George Washington was someone that stayed with his troops. He fought like hell for them. He pleaded with Congress to get the resources that he needed. And he was someone that showed that he's not above common soldiery. Although he could have stayed in a house, he stayed camped with his men, which just makes him all the more credible and powerful. So one thing I really like about this book is that I think at times we look at individuals that seized power and they did so by force, but that's not the type of leader that's going to leave a lasting legacy or inspire greatness or even lead a nation or a group or a business to be a long-term success. It's those that are strong leaders and they don't take shortcuts. They are looking for ways to better themselves and they're looking for ways to inspire and gain the trust and build leadership capital. Final idea here from themes are morality and alignment. And I'm looking here. I'm actually having a little hard time reading my notes, which is pretty awesome. That I'm realizing now on the spot that I need to work on my penmanship. So let's look here. Okay. So the last idea, morality and alignment. The commander must be wise, trustworthy, benevolent, brave, and disciplined. And the reason for that, again, going back to the strong leadership a little bit, I think these two go hand in hand, is that strong leaders, they have morality and they are benevolent, they're brave and they're disciplined, they're trustworthy. Benevolence, you actually will find if you do study Chinese philosophy, that's probably the best translation, but that is a word that you're going to see peppered throughout Chinese history and philosophy. And ethical leadership is not a weakness. It really is a source of true power. Just to give you a couple examples of that. Nowadays, and I would argue that this is relevant throughout history, but especially today, if you cheat, you lie, or deceive, it's not a matter of if, but when you are found out. To give you just a few examples, FTX, the company that was a crypto platform that was blending their pools of money to fund and inflate numbers, and also using money from their users as a personal piggy bank, or even Enron, or even just individuals that say one thing and then say something the next. It is so difficult to do that at this time because one, we are incredibly interconnected. There's everything's being documented. When I say everything, I'm not trying to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but things can be documented so easily. Everyone's got a phone. It's very easy for someone to film or to look up or even to search for something that you may have done, just because we're all so interconnected, and we're interconnected in an online perspective, in an online sense as well. So it's almost like a cultural surveillance state where, because everyone is so interconnected, we have these tools to monitor, to look up, and to post, and to track what we're doing. Again, I'm not trying to go into conspiracy theorist territory. I'm just saying that it is very easy to be caught because everyone's watching you. Those are the ideas from The Art of War that stood out to me. And I'm really impressed by how applicable all of these are, which is why this book has had such a profound legacy for lasting 2,500 years. Let me give you my hot takes and my rating for The Art of War. This is a book that I basically read at minimum once a year because again, it's universally, I can apply it universally, whether it's in business, my personal life, in my relationships, in negotiations. It has proven it's proven itself for 2,500 years. And on a personal level, the way that I look at this book, and the main idea to me isn't necessarily just winning the battle beforehand. To me, when I read this book, my main takeaway is think before you act. And that intelligence is greater than just strength. It's how we use those strengths. Now, an example of just thinking before you act could be when you're going into a difficult conversation with someone, understanding the terrain, being able to see, okay, well, how do I want to approach this? How is the other side thinking? Where am I weak or where am I strong? And just getting a good lay of the land. And another thing that I think is impressive about this book too is its emphasis on being ethical while at the same time blowing your competition out of the water, right? And ending conflicts before they even begin, which I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. So to give you the rating for The Art of War, I give it 4.5 out of 5 stars. Why? Because of the values and principles and how easily it is to apply these in any facet of your life. And it has worked. Again, I'm going to sound a little bit redundant, but this is a book that has lasted 2,500 years. It's got a very strong legacy, and it's definitely worth rereading time and time again. So to close this out, and within the theme of The Art of War, I would like to give an invitation from one of my favorite series, which is Game of Thrones. And this person that I'm going to quote here is not necessarily someone that we want to look up to as an example, but there is wisdom in what he says here. There's a scene where he's talking to Sansa, and he says, "Fight every battle, everywhere, always in your mind. Everyone is your enemy. Everyone is your friend. Every possible series of events is happening all at once. Live that way, and nothing will surprise you. Everything that happens will be something that you've seen before." That goes to the idea of the art of war, which is that the art of war is trying to be as decisive, as strategic, and playing to your strengths and exploiting the weaknesses of the challenges ahead of you. So thank you for listening. Stay sharp. Follow the podcast. Follow us on social media. And we'll talk to you soon. Thank you, everybody.